Hey everyone, welcome to the Forza Motorsport Competitive Tuning Guide. I've been working with some of the fastest drivers and best tuners in all of Forza to bring you this video that will give you the tools and knowledge you need to build a fast car that suits your driving style. Unlike my previous guides, I won't spend much time here explaining what things like differentials are or how they work in real life. Instead, this video focuses on the in-game practical application of these various tuning values. And I'll give you good ranges to start with to establish a strong base tune, as well as letting you know what you can adjust to change the feel of the car in every aspect of its handling, so that you have a great place to start and know what to change to get the car feeling how you want it to. Now, before we dive into the settings themselves, I do want to briefly cover some basic tuning methodology. In Forza Motorsport, we ultimately have more tuning flexibility than ever before, and even though there are some important settings to maximize pace through cornering grip or drag reduction, a lot of adjustments do come down to some level of preference and feel. And at the end of the day, the best tune is the tune that you are comfortable with. Some of the fastest builds will be hard to drive because they promote heavy oversteer and responsiveness, but if you're struggling to control the car, you aren't going to win races. So focus on what makes you a faster and more confident driver, and use these tuning adjustments as tools to find your best pace. And finally, even though this is a bit of a longer video, know that it is still in no way fully comprehensive. Honestly, each setting here could get its own 10 to 15 minute video to explain all the intricacies and exceptions for all of these settings. But this will get you up to speed without wasting time over explaining things or covering more niche settings and use cases. And with that, let's jump into the tire window. Motorsport rewards grip. So most cars you drive in PvP should likely be on race tires, even in lower classes. In this case, your tires will drive best when set between 28 and 32 psi. You don't want to see your average pressures on track going over about 33 psi in your telemetry. Going too far out of this range in either direction will increase both tire wear and fuel usage, while typically lowering grip as well. Lower within the range will promote stability and give you a less twitchy car with a smoother grip fall off, and it can sometimes help with wheel spin. But I've found that peak grip and efficiency floats closer to the 30 to 31 mark, which also makes the car a bit more responsive. This is a great setting to use to adjust your over-understeer balance, and small differences will make a big impact. Set your base tune with even pressures on the front and rear, and then drop the front or raise the rear just a notch or two to get more corner rotation and oversteer. And then of course the opposite is true if you drop rear pressure or raise front. This will promote more stability and help keep your rear end in check. This is one of the best settings to adjust on a per track basis as well. For example, if you find that the track surface at Barcelona often leads to a bit more understeer, just drop the front a notch when driving on that track. For the majority of players, a universal all-track tune should work just fine, but if you are going to tweak something per track, tire pressures are one of your best options. Now let's move on to gearing. This works more or less as it does in real life, and in most cases for an all-track tune, you really only need to tweak your final drive, where moving the slider towards speed will focus on horsepower and top speed, while moving it towards acceleration drops that top speed for better torque output and acceleration. Adjusting your final drive works by focusing on a few characteristics. 1. Make sure, of course, that you have enough speed for the track. If you're pinning the top of your last gear on straights, you need longer gears. But if you aren't using your gears enough and are struggling to stay in your power band, then you likely need shorter gears. Another area to focus on here is your launch. If you're bogging down or spinning your tires too much at race start, it could cost you a lot of positions right away. You need to be able to at least keep up with the pack. So final drive can often get you close here, but you might want to adjust first or perhaps even second gear just a bit to make sure you make it to turn 1 as fast as possible. The last thing to focus on when adjusting final drive is reducing awkward corners. You might find yourself having to shift up moments before braking into a turn, or maybe you find yourself exiting either too low or too high in a gear with no good middle ground. For an all-track tune, this is gonna happen to some degree on at least a few corners, but if you find it happening too often, tweaking final drive is the right adjustment. Finally, for racing in motorsport, you generally only need to focus on about 5 driving gears. For example, 1st through 5th or 2nd through 6th. Anything more will lead to excessive shifting, which slows you down. It is worth mentioning that at the high end of competitive play, a lot more work can go into the gearing, and a track-specific tune with individually adjusted gears and optimal shift points based on power fall-off can make or break the race. But for the vast majority of players, it just isn't really needed, and final drive adjustments with maybe a minor tweak to 1st and 2nd for launches will get you where you need to be. So let's move on to alignment. The majority of cars in motorsport will find optimal camber values between -1 and -2 on both front and rear. Never run positive camber, and typically rear-wheel drive cars will benefit from more negative camber in the front, while front-wheel drive cars benefit from more negative camber in the rear. More negative values here can lead to more mid-corner grip, but will negatively impact your braking distances as well as corner entry and exit stability. So if you do find yourself wanting a better mid-corner feel, it's often best to adjust caster as well. This setting will give you more front camber in corners while keeping it lower on straights. And it's the perfect setting to turn up if you want the benefits of high mid-corner camber without the downsides. Caster also helps the car feel stable on straights and corner exits, and should typically be set between 5 and 7 degrees on just about all cars. You'll want to use your caster and camber to adjust how the car feels throughout the whole corner, and specifically while transitioning between different parts of the corner while your weight is shifting to different ends of the car. There is more or less a theoretical perfect camber value for every corner that gives you the maximum tire contact patch with the road, and you can look at telemetry to make sure you're at least within the right general range. On the track surface, not including curbs, you never want to see your outside tires in a corner go positive. If you do, add a couple more notches of negative camber to the affected end of the car. And if you never really see your camber dip below -1%, chances are good you can drop camber a bit. You want your camber to float around -0.2 to -1 while maxed out in a corner. This ensures that the suspension angle and tire deformation are giving you maximum grip. Going too high or too low will lead to less grip, but minor adjustments around that value will help you dial in on your cornering balance. Front camber values either too high or too low will lead to understeer, but slightly higher values can help with some mid-corner stability. Incorrect negative camber in the rear will lead to oversteer, but if you set it a bit on the higher end, can promote good rotation and turn-in. Start by optimizing for grip on both front and rear, and then once you find a good base value, small adjustments to that front-rear camber balance can be a great tool to adjust for smoother, more consistent corners. Now, we've kind of skipped over toe, so let's go back to this one. On a base setup, you should leave toe stock to see how the rest of the car feels first, but a good tune will end up adjusting this. Small differences make a big impact, and you should never run more than about 0.5 degrees of toe in either direction. Toe out will promote more turn-in and snappier steering, while toe in leads to more stability and understeer. Typically, front toe will be adjusted out and rear toe in. However, you can run some rear toe out to help the rear of the car rotate on front or all-wheel drive cars, and you could even run some front toe in on something like a GT car to get a really stable turn-in. But I wouldn't generally recommend this, as that stability can be gained elsewhere with less downsides. Bad or over-aggressive toe settings can overheat tires, hurt top speed, and make the car feel significantly less stable. And now with alignment covered, let's talk about anti-roll bars. A stiff, even setup is great as a base here. 40-40 has been the common go-to, but you might prefer 30-30 or even 20-20. Softening the front roll bar will promote more oversteer and cause the front end to roll and bite in more on corners at the cost of some responsiveness, while dropping the rear will lead to more stability and understeer. For specs like the front-wheel drive touring cars, 40-40 seems to be a near perfect setup, and on the GT or other faster rear-wheel drive cars, instead running something like 40 in the front and as low as 1 in the rear gives you a lot of stability and confidence. All-wheel drive cars can benefit from 1 in the front and 40 in the rear to give as much rotation as possible. So as you can see, extremes can work here, but it's also completely viable to start somewhere in the middle and just adjust as needed. For example, some mid-engine cars, like this Porsche, can feel really good with a much more neutral setup. If you're struggling with control through mid to high speed transitions or fast cornering, like in the S-curves at Suzuka or Maggots and Beckett's at Silverstone, then it's likely you need to adjust your ARBs. You want the car to feel responsive when transitioning between left and right turns, but you don't want it to snap and cause oversteer. And now let's talk springs. Your overall spring stiffness will come down to some level of personal preference, but extremes won't work here. I'd recommend staying somewhat near the middle and maybe leaning towards the soft side. So you can start with the stock setup or just with an even balance, and then use this as another general over-understeer adjustment. Softer front springs will lead to more oversteer, softer rear, more understeer. This affects your car in pretty much every aspect of its driving, so it should be used first and foremost to adjust the overall balance and stiffness of the car, and remember to stay away from any extremes. Ride height should generally be as low as possible, which for an all-track tune is usually a couple notches above minimum, and keep your spring stiffness and damping in mind when adjusting ride height. A lower setup might need stiffer springs and damping. Some flatter tracks can get away with a minimum ride height, and some tracks with much more elevation will need it higher. And it is also really important to consider curbs here. If you're smacking into curbs that you should be able to drive over, you likely just need to bring up your ride height a couple notches. Now, you can introduce a bit of rake here by raising the rear more than the front in order to induce more rear rotation, but I've found that this isn't usually worth it, and that rotation can be found elsewhere without the downsides that rake introduces, like changing the aerodynamics and introducing some rear instability, especially on trail braking. Alright, now onto dampers. For a base setup, you'll want your bump stiffness low, between maybe 3 to 5 for an all-track tune, and your rebound high, around 10 or 11 to start. Dropping bump stiffness lower, maybe into the 2s, can give you more grip, but will start to upset the car over rough surfaces like curbs. The same is true for rebound. You can certainly run higher, even up to the max, for more grip, but you might find that it heavily upsets the car over some curbs. More extremes in damping can lead to more grip on a smooth surface, but bringing these values closer together will help the car handle curbs and rapid suspension shifts easier. This also follows the general rule of softer front settings promoting more front grip and oversteer, and softer rear settings providing more stability and grip. And damping can be used to dial in your car's balance through corners, but generally you shouldn't adjust your front and rear damping too far away from each other. And now we get to a brand new window for Forza, suspension geometry. These settings are very effective and can easily overpower most other over or understeer tuning adjustments. There are some very interesting properties to these settings that we won't get into here because it's finicky and just bad advice for probably most of the player base. So on a base tune, I'd suggest leaving these sliders stock, but they will play a very heavy role in your car's feel. Roll center height is a pretty general over-understeer balance adjuster and follows that same rule of softer front promoting oversteer and softer rear promoting understeer. This kind of works in tandem with your spring stiffness by multiplying or mitigating how effective your spring stiffness settings are. So it's important to set good spring rates first, and then you can fine-tune with roll center height. Now, anti-dive and anti-squat are the real big ones here. These have massive impacts on your car's feel during heavy acceleration and braking, which then heavily applies to entering and exiting most corners. Anti-dive affects your stability under braking and corner entry. A higher value will lead to more understeer and stability by preventing the car from diving and shifting weight forward under braking. If you find that your car is feeling too stiff and understeery during corner entry and trail braking, this could be a great setting to turn down. But if you find the car pitching in too aggressively, causing a lot of oversteer, you can turn this up. Now, anti-squat is kind of the same thing for corner exits. A lower setting here will provide a lot of stability on your exits by letting the rear end soak up those forces, but it can come with a pretty high understeer cost, as well as just bogging the rear end down and preventing a good speed on exit. So turning this up will make the rear of the car more lively and responsive on exits, but that does make it harder to manage. Once you have most of your other settings close to dialed in, use anti-dive and squat to really hone in on your car's feel when entering and exiting corners. Now we get to aerodynamics. There aren't any major surprises here, and I would pretty much always suggest running maximum front downforce to put the most grip possible over the front tires. In contrast, you generally want to try and run your rear downforce as low as possible, as a high setting here will add drag and cause understeer and loss of top speed. Front-wheel drive cars are often just fine running minimum rear downforce, but you'll likely find that faster, more downforce-based cars like the GT spec are more comfortable with a bit more downforce, and some very aerodynamics-focused prototype cars might end up running very high or maximum rear aero. You can think of this kind of like a second anti-roll bar at speed. If you're struggling with the rear of the car in those high-speed corners and transitions, it might be because of your rear downforce. A setting too high will lock it down, causing understeer, but too low and it could slide out. So keep your front at max and use your rear downforce to play with rear grip at speed. Now, almost at the end, we get to brakes. Braking balance will be a heavily personal choice, and I can happily say that it's no longer reversed. Moving the slider towards front will put more braking pressure over the front wheels, causing braking stability and understeer, and of course more weight shift towards the front under braking. Whereas moving this towards the rear will make the car much more lively under braking, and allow you to turn in more while trail braking. This really just comes down to how you feel. Don't make big adjustments. A single percentage point has a noticeable impact, but if you find yourself wanting a bit more rotation during braking, you can add a couple degrees of rear bias. And if you're struggling to keep the car straight and controlled under braking, a touch of front bias can make a big difference. And then brake pressure is a pretty simple slider to understand. More braking pressure will cause the brakes to engage and lock up quicker and harder. You never really want this below 100%. It'll just kill your braking distances, but you can absolutely turn this up. Higher pressures will cause you to lock up easier, but also give you a much more instant and stronger braking response. And in racing, you do typically want to hit your maximum braking pressure for the corner as soon as possible, and then trail off as you turn into the corner. So a higher pressure could help with that, as long as you find yourself still able to be light with the brakes when you need to be, and aren't jerking the car around too aggressively during corrections or trail braking. So this will depend a lot on your driving style, game settings, and input device. Having ABS on will mitigate the effectiveness of braking pressure, but for me, on load cell pedals, it still had a noticeable impact with ABS on. And this brings us to our last main tuning setting, the differential. The goal here is to run an acceleration setting as high as possible and a deceleration setting as low as possible in order to promote the most rotation, oversteer, and speed. In front-wheel drive cars, this likely means maxing or nearly maxing out your acceleration and running no decel. But in rear-wheel drive setups, you'll have to find a comfortable point between about 50 to 90% on acceleration. High settings lead to more on-throttle oversteer, whereas a lower setting will allow you to get on throttle more comfortably, but often with more understeer and less speed. So find the setting that works best for you and your car. You can also use the decel setting in rear or all-wheel drive cars to promote more off-throttle and corner entry understeer and stability. Don't turn this up too high, but anything between about 0 and 25% is probably a good range to feel out for personal preference. And folks, that just about brings us to the end, but I do have one more bonus tip for all you controller players. Steering lock does affect handling on gamepads. You can almost think of this like a slider between normal and simulation steering, where a higher setting makes the steering fast and responsive, but turning this down can help smooth out your inputs a bit by slowing the steering response. So if you're on controller and just find yourself struggling to control some of the car's in general, this might be a good setting to look at. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you everyone for being patient with me on this one. I really wanted to wait until the dust settled a bit on the game and give people time to figure out the best settings before I started to work on this guide, but I am now very confident that everything in this video will help you shave massive amounts of time off your laps while improving the feel of your cars. And finally, before we wrap up, I do want to give a huge shout out to everyone that helped me with this video. A lot of testing went into this, and I want to mention Matsura, Yunos, and the whole ESV gang, especially Lawrence, for doing all the testing and working with me to ensure that this guide would be as accurate as it could be. So huge thanks to those guys for helping out, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.